the trip to Jerusalem from the heart of the Persian Empire was not going to be such an easy trip. Again, we keep in mind that we talked about how Ezra had to seek out the help of the Levites to help carry a lot of the things that had been dedicated to the temple. And that's because, as we saw in the Old Testament, that was their actual responsibility. So by the time that we got to chapter 8, at least where we left off, we noticed that they were able to arrive. And as soon as they arrived, remember that they had offered sacrifices. Again, they delivered the king's orders. And again, that was all in part to help defend what Ezra's work would be. And that obviously becomes very significant in light of what happens in chapter 9. And chapter 9, in some ways, is kind of the final section of the book. And in this final section, this is where Ezra is going to have to deal with a major problem. And in what we're looking at this morning, we're going to call this the present crisis. Remember that we talked about how in the returning families or whatever, that in chapter 8, the first individual that we read about, at least his descendants arriving back in Jerusalem, was Phinehas. And again, we talked about that the reason why Phinehas is mentioned is because specifically Phinehas's work back in Numbers 25 parallels essentially with what Ezra will have to deal with in Ezra chapter 9 and 10. And so that's obviously going to be what this present crisis is dealing with. And we're going to look at verses 1 through 5 this morning. And then hopefully next week we'll look at verses 6 through 15 and how Ezra is going to respond to this issue. So this is the present crisis. What are the key things to keep in mind? First of all, you have to keep in mind that things are not always perfect among the people of God. We talked about that Ezra has already mentioned in chapter 8 that to the priests, the Levites, those that traveled from the heart of the Persian Empire to Jerusalem, we've already talked about that was identified as a holy mission, right? And we talked about how Ezra fasted, the people fasted, there was preparation that went in before they made that trip. And as we talked about, that was all a way to help identify that this trip would be different, right? The mission that they had was different. And so you think that if you're going to go from the Persian Empire to Israel, right, which is supposed to be the home of God's people, you would think that everything's fine. Well, as we'll see in chapters 9 and 10, that's obviously not the case. Things are not fine, even though you would think that, morally speaking, things are better among the people of God. That's not always the case. And certainly we know that can be true as well, right? We're all human beings. We are all still capable of committing sins after we convert. We are all still plagued with the problem of temptation. And we certainly know that things are not perfect amongst ourselves all the time. Sometimes we might forget that, right? Sometimes we might have in our minds, the expectation that things are perfect among the people of God. Well, that's obviously not always the case, as what Ezra will see and have to deal with in chapters 9 and 10. That'll be something to think about as we look at verses 1 through 5. And then the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that in a lot of cases, whenever you teach the truth, what it does is it shines light on the darkness that is around you, right? Because in the process of teaching truth, you also have to talk about what sin is, right? And what types of actions are deemed sinful by God. And so as a result of that, by teaching the truth, you're going to help expose practices that people might think are normal, but in reality, practices that are sinful. And that will be the case as we'll tie it in with what Ezra's role is in chapters 9 and 10. But those are the two things to keep in mind this morning as we look at Ezra chapter 9, verses 1 through 5. So the crisis presented, we start off first of all, in verses 1 and 2, with the issue that is present. So, Ezra chapter 9, let's read verses 1 and 2. When these things were done, the leaders came to me, saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with respect to the abominations of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, so that the holy seed is mixed with the people of those lands. Indeed, the hand of the leaders and rulers has been foremost in this trespass. All right, so we got to keep in mind how much time elapses between Ezra's arrival and now in verses 1 and 2, him being presented with this situation. So notice that in verse 1, and it depends on what translation that you have, but in the New King James, it translates the beginning of verse 1 as when these things were done. In other words, this is a reference back to the sacrifices, back to Ezra presenting the letter and what the king had to say about Ezra's work. So after these things take place, this is where this situation arises, where Ezra is presented with this crisis. Now, from what we understand, perhaps there's about 4 months that elapse from the end of chapter 8 to chapter 9. So if somebody would read for us Ezra chapter 7. Ezra chapter 7. I didn't write down the verse for it. But Ezra, read verse 9.
Upon the first day of the first month began he to go up from Babylon, and on the first day of the fifth month came he to Jerusalem, according to the good hand of his God upon him.
I was in chapter 8. That's why I was looking at 8 and verse 9, and that was a list of names. So, chapter 7, verse 9 is what we're looking for. Right, it says that on the first day of the fifth month that he came to Jerusalem, which would coincide with the end of chapter 8. But then if we go over to chapter 10, we notice that the people are going to come to him, verse 9 of chapter 10. We notice that, so all the men of Judah and Benjamin gathered to Jerusalem within 3 days. It was the 9th month on the 20th of the month. So approximately 4 months have elapsed between the end of chapter 8 and now being presented with this problem. And so naturally, you might have in mind the question, right, why is this not the first thing that Ezra dealt with? Well, keep in mind that there are a lot of people, right, a lot of the people of God living in this area. We talked about that under Zerubbabel, that some speculate about 50,000 people arrived under Zerubbabel. And then you've got the people that arrived under Ezra. You've got people that marry, have kids, population grows. You got a lot of people in this area, which would help explain why this is not a problem that's immediately addressed. But in part, one of the reasons why this comes up and is presented in front of Ezra is perhaps because what did Ezra bring with him from Persia to Jerusalem? He brought all that, but he also brought something else that was just as significant. The law, right? Remember that apparently they did not have a written copy of the entire law. And as we talked about, Ezra's role was to bring the law and also to teach the law to the people in Jerusalem. And so, as it might have happened over the course of the 4 months where Ezra taught the law, he also taught the people, at least perhaps some who had, for whatever reason, forgotten this principle or this part of the law, but he obviously had to teach the law, as we'll see in a minute, in respect to the Israelites not being able to marry into marrying certain women from these foreign nations that are talked about. So again, that's why we said that, when you teach the truth, sometimes that, brings light on the darkness of sin, helps bring people awareness to sin. And perhaps that's exactly what has happened here. Ezra has taught for 4 months after his arrival. And now, because of his teaching, people realize there's this sinful practice that has not been dealt with. And now it's brought before Ezra to do something about it. All right, so 4 months elapsed. Again, that may help explain why this problem is not immediately dealt with, because Ezra had to teach for 4 months to help essentially bring attention to it. And so Ezra's presentation of the law of God then is in part what helps bring attention to this issue, right? This serious problem, as verses 1 and 2 indicate for us. So let's talk about the key issue. The key issue in verse 1, it says that the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands. All right, so as we notice in verse 2, that's obviously going to be applied to the concept of marriage, as we'll go back and look at that in a minute. But they have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land. If somebody would read for us Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 4.
When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land where you go to possess it, and has cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and destroy thee suddenly.
So perhaps this is what Ezra taught. As we know, we've already seen, the book of Ezra makes significant references back to the Old Testament law. And so Ezra gets up and presents this part of the book of Deuteronomy to the people. Obviously, this is what triggers people being aware that what Ezra warned about in his teaching lines up with what Deuteronomy 7, what Moses had said centuries before. And so when you look at chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, what was the people of God's response? What was supposed to be their relationship essentially with the native people in the land of Canaan? Yeah, hands off, no marriage, right? Remember that Joshua, when he led the people into the land of Canaan, what was God's expectation for Joshua? Yeah, drive them out, right? Wipe them out. Because, as it says in verse 4, what would happen to the people of Israel if they did not drive out the inhabitants of the land of Canaan? Yeah, they're going to turn to serve other gods. The anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. Right? And, as we'll see in a minute, keep in mind that these people are very much aware of what led to captivity in the first place. And those who are going to be caught up in this issue are also going to be reminded of this through the teaching of Ezra. But keep in mind that they, according to Deuteronomy 7, were expected to keep themselves from the people of the land. Now, this is a map of the divided kingdom, but the individuals that are mentioned in verse 2, at least the first few nations, along with those nations mentioned in Deuteronomy 7, would have been the original inhabitants of the land of Canaan, or today Palestine, but that area where the divided kingdom eventually sets up. But notice that we also have other nations mentioned here in verse 1 that are not mentioned in Deuteronomy 7. Notice that you've got the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. Now, in the Old Testament, God did differentiate between some of these nations that the Israelites would encounter. So, for instance, the Moabites and the Ammonites had a specific restriction set on them, and that was that they were banned from the assembly of God in the Old Testament. If somebody would, read for us Deuteronomy 23, 12 through 16. Yeah, 2 to 6, not 20. Yeah, right.
One of illegitimate birth shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to his 10th generation shall he not enter into the congregation of the Lord. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. Because they met you not with bread and with water in the way, when you came forth out of Egypt, and because they hired against thee Balaam the son of Beor, Pethor, Mesopotamia, to curse thee. Nevertheless, the Lord thy God will not hearken unto Balaam, but the Lord thy God turned the curse into a blessing unto thee, because the Lord thy God loved thee. Thou shalt not seek their peace nor their prosperity all thy days forever.
All right, so notice that in verse 3, right, it specifies the Ammonite or the Moabite. And as it states there, the prohibition on them under the Old Testament law was they could not enter into the assembly of the Lord, which meant that they could not go where? In Ezra's time, where could they not go? They could not go into the temple. They could not go into the temple court according to the law that was established in Deuteronomy 23. Now, in Ezra chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, who has been caught up in this problem in verse 1? In verse 1, who's caught up in this problem? Yeah, right. Notice that it says the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands. So that's a problem. The point is that's a problem for Ezra, right? The Ammonites and the Moabites, as they were presented, could not enter into the assembly of the Lord. Yet, in Ezra's day, we're reading about priests who have been guilty of this problem. And perhaps, by implication, you've had Ammonites and Moabites enter into the assembly of the Lord, right? Which was something specifically forbidden. Now, it wasn't read for us, but in verse 7, God did distinguish the Edomites and the Egyptians as a little bit different because they were not supposed to abhor them or hate them. But in verses 1 and 2, this is the present problem. You've got individuals who have not forbidden themselves from marriage to the people of the land. You might have priests and the Levites having married individuals or women from the Moabites and the Ammonites. That was not supposed to happen because the Moabites and the Ammonites could not enter into the presence of the Lord. And that's the problem that Ezra is confronted with. I think about the ban on the assembly of the Lord. I think it points more to the impact of Ephesians chapter 2, verses 12 through 14, where the Apostle Paul wrote about how through Jesus Christ, God had made those who were far away, he had made them nigh or brought them near to God. And in Ephesians 2 and verse 14, Paul's very clear to the Gentile population that God had destroyed the wall of partition that separated themselves from the people of God. I don't really understand the significance of the idea of God destroying the partition between Jew and Gentile until you think about a passage like Deuteronomy 23, where under the Old Testament law, if you're a Moabite and you're an Ammonite, even if you convert to Judaism, you don't belong in God's assembly under the Old Testament law. So to me, that gives a lot of weight to the idea of that wall of partition being broken down to allow Jew and Gentile into the assembly of God. Just something that stands out in my mind. Now, while that was the law, there were obviously times where we saw exceptions to this. So, for instance, in the Old Testament, where do we see exceptions where a person within the people of God was essentially allowed to marry somebody outside of the nation? Moses did, right? Moses' wife Zipporah was not of the people of God. What famous woman decided to leave her homeland to go with her mother-in-law back to the nation of Israel? Ruth was from where? Moab, right? There were some notable exceptions to this, and that's going to be at the bottom of this. But, the point is that the key issue here was idolatry, right? Israel was supposed to be holy. In Deuteronomy 7 and verse 6, again, you notice that in verse 2 of Ezra 9, they make the point that the holy seed is mixed with the people of those lands. Because the concept, again, of being holy is that they are separate, that they are different from those that are around them. So, to be holy, they had to keep themselves away from those type of marriages, at least under the Old Testament law. And so, the key issue, as we know, is that idolatry could easily lead Israel away again. And that's what happens in Exodus 34, verses 15 and 16. That's the warning given there that by marrying into these other nations, that it would eventually lead the people away into idolatry. And so that's probably what these individuals are recognizing here, right? At the teaching of the law that Ezra has given and laid down, they recognize that because of these marriages, they are creating a scenario where the people of God will return back to idolatry as their ancestors had done. And so what would that mean to them in Ezra chapter 9 if that continued?
Back where they started.
Be back right where they started, but then where does that lead to? Because that's the seriousness of it, essentially. Which then leads to what? Yeah, destruction's the point, right? That's what they recognize here. We've got this problem. It hasn't been addressed. We already know that it's a problem from the Old Testament. And as the Old Testament and the law of God has already stated, the ultimate punishment for all of this is not just you're led away from God, but eventually it leads to your own destruction is the point. And that's why this is a serious problem. That's why Ezra is going to respond the way that he does. Because of the fact that a lot of times these relationships specifically led to the problem of idolatry. Now, sometimes it didn't. Again, Zipporah and Ruth would be examples of women who did not lead their husbands astray into idolatry, despite the fact that they were not originally of the people of God. You go to Deuteronomy 29, verses 10 through 12. The Old Testament law also specified that there were a group of people who could live among the people of God, and the Old Testament simply referred to them as sojourners in the land. So this was not an outright prohibition on every single foreigner in the land of Israel, but only those that God had deemed that the people of God could not, essentially they could not continue to live with and expect to remain faithful to him. And so that's the key issue. So what's Ezra's response to it? Notice that verses 3 through 5, this is what's said. So when I heard this thing, again, Ezra, when I heard this thing, I tore my garment and my robe and plucked out some of the hair of my head and beard and sat down astonished. Then everyone who trembled at the words of the God of Israel assembled to me because of the transgression of those who had been carried away captive, and I sat astonished until the evening sacrifice. And at the evening sacrifice I arose from my fasting, having torn my garment and my robe. I fell on my knees and spread out my hands to the Lord my God. And next week we'll talk about what his actual statements are to God in response to this. But we notice that Ezra's response in verses 3 and 4 is one of extreme sadness or extreme mourning. So notice verse 3 again. I heard this thing. It says that he sat down astonished. Some translations may have the word horrified there. The root word that's used there to describe Ezra's astonishment, or the fact that he was horrified, is actually the same word that can be translated as desolate in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 31. And in that passage, what Daniel is talking about is the desolation of the temple, or the corruption of the temple, that would occur a couple of centuries into the future. And that's essentially what Ezekiel, or what Ezra is seeing here with this practice that has gone on. Just as anyone would be, just as any faithful follower of God at this point would have been horrified with the desecration of the altar in the temple, Ezra is just as horrified because he recognizes that this practice, if it is not corrected, is going to lead to the exact same fate that his ancestors had to deal with. And so he's going to have to deal with this problem. I think I actually accidentally deleted a slide, but I wanted to point out as well that Ezra is not the only one at the time who deals with this problem. Towards the end of the Old Testament, we have the book of Malachi. Malachi was a contemporary, might have actually come a little bit later than Ezra. But in Malachi chapter 2, Malachi also has to deal with this same problem that takes place. And if somebody would, read for us Malachi chapter 2, verses 13 through 16.
This have you done again, covering the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping, and with crying out, insomuch that he regards not the offering any more, or receives it with goodwill at your hand. Yet you say, wherefore? Because the Lord has been witness between thee and the wife of thy youth, against whom thou hast dealt treacherously, yet is she thy companion and the wife of thy covenant. And did not he make one? Yet he had the remnant of the Spirit. And wherefore one, that he might seek a godly offspring. Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously against the wife of his youth. For the Lord, the God of Israel, says that he hates divorce. For one covers violence with his garment, said the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your spirit, that you deal not treacherously.
So the issue that Malachi is addressing there is apparently the problem where the men of Israel were actually divorcing their Jewish wives so that they could go and marry foreign wives. And that's why it says in verse 15 that God seeks godly offspring, because apparently what was happening is that when they divorced their Jewish wives, they married a foreign wife, their offspring would just grow up in idolatry. Right? And so Malachi is having to address that situation as a prophet, which just goes to show you apparently how big of an issue this was, where the people of God, for whatever reason, decided that it was okay to marry into these foreign relationships so that eventually it resulted in the fact that their kids grew up in idolatry. And Malachi and Ezra points out this is an extremely big problem. Now, for Ezra, I think in large part his response to all of this is the fact that Ezra has recognized the goodness of God in his life. You know, we talked about how Ezra had already told the king of Persia, that he did not need a military escort because he said God would protect him, right? He made that point clear when they fasted before they left the river Ahava to go to Jerusalem, right? That God would be with them, God would protect them. They got to Jerusalem safely without a military escort. Ezra contributed that to the work of God. And so God's goodness, he knows all about that, right? And so now that this problem is presented, he's certainly concerned about the goodness of God leaving him. You know, when you think back to David and Bathsheba, you think back to Psalm 51, I believe. You know, when David wrote that psalm in response to his sin with Bathsheba, what did David request of God to not take away from him? Right. Don't take your spirit, don't take your presence away from me. David knew the goodness of God, and he was afraid of what would happen once God's goodness went away because of that sin. Ezra is likewise, even though he is not guilty of it, he certainly understands that he could suffer the consequences of this sin being tolerated. Again, keep in mind, Phinehas suffered, at least his family suffered because of the plague, suffered because of the fact that that one couple was being tolerated, right? In Numbers 25. That's why he went out and did something about it. That's exactly what Ezra is going to do. Even though Ezra himself is not guilty of this sin, he understands that if he continues to tolerate it, that he's going to suffer the consequences as well. He's seen the goodness of God, and he doesn't want that to depart from God's people. Notice that in verse 4, that it says that everyone who trembled at the words of the God of Israel assembled to me, because of the transgression of those who had been carried away captive, and I sat astonished until the evening sacrificed. Again, the word tremble there would carry the idea of having the fear of God. It's also, the same word is also used in Isaiah chapter 66 to identify the holy people of God and how they did not tolerate the other Israelites who would try to worship God and worship foreign gods as well. And that's the indication here. Those who trembled at the words of God, the words of the God of Israel, in essence, trembled because they recognized how serious of a problem this was and how it needed to be dealt with. And that's what we're going to see Ezra begin to do in verses 6 through 15. He's going to go to God to plead on his people's behalf. And that's where in chapter 10 we're going to see it set up to the problem being solved. Or at least Ezra doing his part to solve the problem. But if you think back to those key points as we talked about, right, the fact that in light of what has happened, things are not always perfect among the people of God. Ezra now realizes that, right? Ezra realizes because of his teaching that this present darkness is now present. He's aware of it now. And that's something that we have to deal with as Christians. Again, we're not always going to make people in the church happy because sometimes we have to help deal with imperfections. We have to deal with sin in the lives of people within the church, people within our families. That's not always a pleasant conversation, but what Ezra is going to help us realize is that just because it's not a pleasant conversation doesn't mean that conversation should not happen, right? You can't just allow it to keep going on without doing something about it. And so Ezra has helped expose this problem, but now, as we're going to see beginning next week, he's going to have to do something about it. And so that's where we're going to stop this morning. Are there any final comments or questions about what we've talked about?
See the desire of God to keep his people pure. And of course, in the Old Testament, God wants the Jews to be pure. One reason is his son, of course, will eventually come through the Jewish line. And obviously, God wants his people to be pure today also to prepare us for heaven.
Right. Absolutely.
No, also, it's always been like that throughout history. If everybody does what they're supposed to do, God tolerates this for a while, but sooner or later, his vengeance will come around, and the consequences of your sins will get to you sooner or later. You might get by with it for a while, and like you've been punished for something that someone else has done. But sometimes it's in ignorance, and sometimes it's not. Just like today, sometimes we know to do better, but we think, well, I'm getting by with it. I keep doing it.
Right.
Sooner or later, you will have to pay for it.
Right.
And sometimes your loved ones have to pay for it. The
Right.
consequences of what you did in your life.
Right. Yeah, and that's going to be Ezra's point, right? He's not just going to pass this along to somebody down the line. He recognizes this has got to be dealt with immediately. Those are good thoughts. We'll pick up in verse 6 next week. But thank you for your time and your attention this morning.